the hearing record. Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm David Nelson, investigator with the Committee on Energy and Commerce. I'm accompanied by Kevin Barstow, counsel, and Richard Wilfong, an investigator with the committee staff.
Would you pull your mic up a little closer, sir?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, you and Chairman Dingell dispatched us to China on August 17th to ascertain whether foodstuffs from that country could be imported safely into the United States. We met with Chinese and Hong Kong government officials, U.S. government officials, American and other multinational executives involved in processing and distributing of food in China and Hong Kong, and reporters from bureaus in Beijing and Hong Kong that cover food issues for their media outlets. The report of that trip is attached to this summary statement. Based on information gathered before and during the trip, the staff has made the following observations. First, the Chinese food supply chain does not meet international safety standards. It is in fact responsible for very serious domestic Chinese food poisoning outbreaks. Second, the Chinese government appears determined to avoid embarrassing food safety outbreaks in its export markets due to the damaging and potentially lasting effect this would have upon the Made in China branding. Third, the lack of meaningful internal regulation of farming and food processing in China, the advanced development of the document counterfeiting industry, and the willingness of some entrepreneurs in both China and the United States to smuggle foodstuffs that do not meet quality standards necessitates a much more vigorous program of inspection and laboratory testing in China and at U.S. ports of entry than the Food and Drug Administration has been willing or able to pursue to date. The responsibility for quality assurance, both of imports and exports, rests with the AQSIQ in China, the General Administration of Quality Supervision, Inspection, and Quarantine of the People's Republic. The AQSIQ officials issued a white paper on August 17, 2007, which is included in the exhibit book dealing with food safety. This paper details China's export quality assurance program. While in China, we had an opportunity to discuss components of this program with AQSIQ officials as well as other Chinese agency officials. We were advised that a sample from each lot of product for export is pulled by a government inspector and tested in a government laboratory to ensure it meets Chinese standards and the standards of the importing country. Export certificates are then granted by local Chinese Inspection and Quarantine, CIQ offices. CIQ are local equivalents, municipal equivalent to AQSIQ. We were shown how importers' paperwork is joined with laboratory test results before the certificate is issued. And when the certificate is issued, the information is sent to the port of exit electronically to assure that the physical goods correspond to the export certificate before loading. The Chinese position is that theirs is a closed system that assures the safety of foods that bear the CIQ certificates and seal. To date, FDA has refused to acknowledge the Chinese certificates. If the Chinese system worked as described, it would be a very safe system. However, we did not find any American or other multinational executive operating in China that believed that China has a competent independent inspector overseeing each of the 12,714 plants that are approved for export, or even of the 3,700 plants that, according to Chinese officials, are fully HACCP controlled. Nor did we find anyone that believed that every single lot was sampled. Finally, it was widely believed the export certificates were subject to counterfeiting. There was agreement among everyone we talked to about the sincerity and scope of the AQSIQ's efforts, but much less enthusiasm about the willingness of local CIQs to follow the central government's dictates. And we were told that it's at the local level where the system succeeds or fails. We made inquiries about two possible models. One of the models, the Chinese food exports to Hong Kong, was broached directly with the Hong Kong government. The other, the Chinese food delivered to Japan, was discussed with knowledgeable sources, but not the Japanese government due to the time limitations of the trip. An overview of their findings of our findings regarding these two models is presented in the trip report. Can food be imported from China safely? The Japanese and Hong Kong models are each safer than the FDA system for regulating food imports. The Hong Kong system involves massive sampling and thus not be practical for the economy of our size. Last year, the Hong Kong government tested in their laboratory 64,000 samples. If we were to test an equivalent proportion of samples country the size of the United States would be over 2 million in FDA labs. That simply is so far beyond the capacity that it's hard to even imagine if we could build that much laboratory space very quickly. The Japanese system of inspecting a very limited number of facilities that are permitted to sell food to China does appear to offer a much better control system than currently employed by the FDA. But the Japanese also inspect and test 15% of their food imports. We inspect 1% and test a fraction of that. However, to the extent that the Chinese products for the Japanese market are insulated from excessive downward pressure on prices, and that's a real problem, the incessant pressure on downward prices on people that are producing at the margin causes a lot of shortcuts to be taken in a lot of products over there. To the extent they're insulated from downward pressure on prices, the Japanese consumers pay for the added safety in the form of somewhat higher prices. The size of the price effect is not known. At a minimum, it would appear that the U.S. could cut safety risks significantly were FDA to limit food imports from China to those firms that have obtained the appropriate certificates from the Chinese government. For all the reasons noted in this report, such certificates are no guarantee of safe imports, particularly if there's not an electronic transmittal system in place of the paper certificates. However, the absence of such certificates most certainly means that the Chinese quality control system has been evaded by their exporters. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. Mr. Barstow, Mr. Wilfong, and myself look forward to answering any questions you or other members may have about our testimony and investigation.